We didn't default. The Republican Party is still a huge problem. The 4-month-long Washington drama over the debt ceiling is likely to end without much changing. No default. Or cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Or huge reductions to other programs. Or the dethroning of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Or the invocation of the 14th Amendment by President Biden. That's good news right now, but it's worrisome in the long term. Like many on the political left, I was nervous for much of May. It seemed as if Biden was so desperate for a deal to raise the debt ceiling that he would accept major spending cuts and work requirements for programs such as Medicaid that would have led to millions of people losing benefits. It also seemed that Biden and his aides were too quick to dismiss the 14th Amendment and other options to avoid surrendering to the Republicans' demands because of the president's preferences for bipartisanship and following traditional Washington norms. But the final deal isn't terrible. I am disappointed that a precedent was reinforced that Republicans can use the debt ceiling to hold the nation hostage and accomplish policy goals that they otherwise couldn't. Keeping spending at 2023 levels, as the agreement calls for, constitutes a small cut because of inflation. The agreement is really bad on student loans, mandating the restart of payments, even as the Supreme Court is likely to invalidate Biden's loan cancellation program. Cuts in Internal Revenue Service funding, the approval of a gas pipeline in parts of Virginia and West Virginia, and expanded work requirements for people to get financial assistance to purchase food are flawed policies. But my worst fears were not realized. The great news is that the debt ceiling will be raised until 2025, so Republicans can't use it as a weapon before the presidential election. It's also really good news, and somewhat surprising to me, that McCarthy and other Republicans weren't so determined to weaken Biden politically that they were willing to destroy the economy either by forcing a default or imposing huge, job-killing cuts in spending. The absence of large-scale terrible policies in this agreement is good news. The bad news is that a lot of people are likely to walk away from this process thinking everything is generally fine. It is not. For months of debate about whether the country will have a catastrophic economic event was something that rightly made people afraid. And because little actually changed, this is 4 months that the nation's political leaders could have spent on other things. McCarthy and other Republicans didn't gain much from this fight, but they didn't lose anything. So Republicans are likely to use the debt ceiling as a bargaining chip again, and perhaps more effectively next time. Biden is likely to emerge from this deal even more confident that being bipartisan and optimistic is the way forward. That would be true if the state of U.S. politics was measured solely by how many votes from both parties' major bills in Congress get. But the Republican Party doesn't need legislation in Washington to accomplish its priorities and weaken Biden. Working largely through the courts and state legislatures, Republican officials are severely curtailing the reproductive freedom of women, the political power of Black Americans, the very existence of transgender Americans, and everyone's safety from gun violence. I worry that, perhaps worst of all, the deal encourages America's leaders and institutions to continue sleepwalking through the huge crisis we are in. We have an increasingly anti-democratic Republican Party that is pushing the nation toward a cold civil war. Red states and blue states have divergent policies, and the officials in red ones keep curbing the rights and powers of people who don't agree with them. But many business leaders, media executives, and others desperately want to duck the radicalism of the Republican Party. They suggest there is a sensible center that each party should aim for, and they cast left-leaning figures such as Senator Bernie Sanders, Independent Vermont, and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Democrat New York, as equally problematic as former President Donald Trump. A months-long, heavily hyped standoff that ended with a bipartisan compromise will encourage this wrong-headed analysis of what ails American politics. We are now headed toward a presidential election in which a truly radical, anti-democratic person, Trump or Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, looks to have a strong chance of being elected president. And the biggest priority of many in the news media and the business community will be to play down that person's radicalism to show objectivity and neutrality. We didn't default. That's good. But the extremism of today's Republican Party remains a huge threat to the country. This deal is a relief. It's not cause for celebration. We didn't default. The Republican Party is still a huge problem. The 4-month-long Washington drama over the debt ceiling is likely to end without much changing. No default. Or cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Or huge reductions to other programs. Or the dethroning of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Or the invocation of the 14th Amendment by President Biden. What 8 right-leaning columnists think about Republican candidates for 2024. I confess I didn't invite George F. Will, because I figured he writes exclusively in taut 750-word increments. But I gathered the rest of the right-leaning, though not, in the minds of a vocal subset of our readers, right-thinking, columnists at Post Opinions for a conversation over email about the state of the 2024 Republican presidential primary. Ron DeSantis is finally in. So is Tim Scott. Nikki Haley, Asa Hutchinson, Vivek Ramaswamy and Donald Trump were already there. Here comes Chris Christie next week, and soon enough he'll be joined by Mike Pence and, we assume, Chris Sununu. So, I asked, we have, at last, a field. Are you happy with it? I'll let them take it from here. Jim Garrity, in a normal political environment, Republicans would be thrilled with the emerging 2024 presidential field. But this is not a normal political environment, is it? So far, and yes, it is early, most Republicans don't appear to be the slightest bit interested in any candidate not named Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis. Henry Olsen, it looks like a two-person race for one simple reason: only DeSantis and Trump have credibility with the MAGA majority of the primary electorate. Unless that changes, any seeming surge by someone else, hello, Tim Scott, will simply be a sign that person is consolidating the non-MAGA minority. Jason Willick, if Trump had lost in 2020 like a normal president, leaving office uneventfully without inspiring a riot, there probably wouldn't even be a 2024 primary of consequence. Republican voters loved Trump's performance in office by huge margins. In retrospect, if January 6 hadn't happened, Trump's pitch, "Who's ready for round 2?" would face little resistance. Hugh Hewitt, any pundit should be cautious when assessing the GOP field. Will the future nominee even be on the debate stage in Milwaukee in August when the Republican National Committee kicks off the first in a schedule of candidate gatherings? We don't know for sure yet whether former President Trump will deign to join the group that assembles that night. We also don't know when the Iowa caucuses will gather or when New Hampshire voters will vote. Ramesh Ponnuru, I suspect that Jason is wrong about what would have happened if Trump acknowledged his defeat in 2020. Modern parties are pretty unforgiving toward losers, which helps explain